February 2022. Putin gives the order for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin expects Kyiv to collapse quickly. In Putin's calculation, the West would lack resolve and fail to provide serious support. Once again, Moscow tried to redraw borders by force, and once again, that calculation failed. The brutality of Russia's war shocked the world. It triggered an unprecedented response. Western countries united and developed a strategy to contain and counter Putin's aggression. These shifts are not temporary. They will shape European and global politics for decades. How far has Russia fallen during its full-scale war against Ukraine? And can the European Union maintain leadership in shaping Europe's collective security? This is what we discuss with experts in a new episode of the Project Isolated. European politics is undergoing profound change. Security has become the central issue, and the main threat today is Putin's Russia. In this context, Ukraine is no longer just a partner. It is increasingly becoming part of Europe's shared security architecture. Welcome. Joining us today is political analyst Volodymyr Fesenko. Glad to have you with us. If we set aside voices that openly dissent from the general consensus, what role do leading countries play in further isolating Russia? Germany, Italy, Poland, the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, and the United Kingdom. It is no longer part of the EU, but remains one of our key partners.
What is fundamentally important is that within Europe, on the European continent, Ukraine's role as a partner is not limited to the European Union as an institution, because the leadership of the EU, the European Commission, its President Ursula von der Leyen, the heads of European diplomacy, including Kaja Kallas, and the European Council, which brings together the leaders of EU member states, all actively support Ukraine. And in fact, the absolute majority of EU countries support us as well, with the exception of Orban's government and partly Slovakia. At the same time, influential European countries outside the EU also support Ukraine. Not only the United Kingdom, but Norway as well. Norway is a relatively small country by population, but a wealthy one, and it provides substantial financial support. For next year alone, support of $7 billion has been announced, along with military assistance. Denmark, another relatively small European country, also provides enormous support, both military and financial. A key part of this support is the so-called Danish Initiative, where European countries finance Ukraine's defense production, including on their own territory, as is now the case with the Flamingo missiles and several other projects. This makes the support multi-layered, and that, I believe, is its strength and flexibility. Because yes, due to political circumstances, support can weaken in some countries, as we are now seeing in Czechia. But within the European Union, unfortunately, there are only a few countries, literally one or two at the moment, that stand apart. Perhaps one more may appear in a partial role.
Maybe Hungary and Slovakia.
Yes, essentially that is correct. Primarily Orban's government and partly Slovakia. These governments tend to bargain, to seek compromises, but they are not on our side. And as the history of sanctions against Russia shows, the issue of supporting Ukraine, including Ukraine's European integration, is where Orban constantly puts obstacles in our path.
But the issue still seems solvable.
It is being solved, but it often takes time. The core problem is the consensus mechanism, which unfortunately makes rapid decision-making difficult. We see this most clearly in the issue of providing assistance to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets. The assets are frozen, but Belgium, where the depositories holding these assets are located, fears taking responsibility and legal risks. As a result, the compromise solution, what is known as a reparations loan or reparations credit for Ukraine, has still not been resolved. That is why a compromise format emerged this spring, which I consider promising, even though many criticize it. This is the coalition of the willing. Some call it in advance the coalition of the determined. This is a group of countries that are ready to support us. They are already providing weapons, financial assistance, and political backing. They have united in this informal coalition. Within this coalition, there is no veto power. No one can block decisions. Yes, not everyone is ready to help at the same level. This also relates to security guarantees. At least 2 countries are prepared, after the war ends, to deploy limited military contingents to Ukraine: the United Kingdom and France, possibly others. Some will help financially, others politically or morally, including through voting within the European Union. It is a multi-level combination. In the long term, I believe this coalition format may become the prototype for new blocs and alliances, especially security partnerships involving Ukraine.
According to the Kremlin's plan, a prolonged conflict was meant to exhaust Ukraine. However, it is now becoming clear that a war of attrition is not only ineffective against Kyiv, it is destroying Russia itself. Serious problems are emerging in Russia's oil sector, particularly due to the latest sanctions imposed by the United States. This is happening amid falling prices for Russian raw materials. By late autumn 2025, Urals crude had dropped to near a 3-year low, just over $36 per barrel in Novorossiysk. Under pressure from Washington, major buyers are cutting imports. The Western strategy of 1,000 cuts is steadily weakening Russia's economy. Joining us is Igor Lipsitz, Doctor of Economic Sciences and Professor. Glad to see you. I would like to begin our conversation with this question. How would you assess what is currently happening in the Russian economy and what parallels can be drawn?
What we are seeing in Russia today increasingly resembles a return to the early 1990s. Not the end of that decade, but its beginning. In 1990, the Soviet Union still existed. In 1991, it collapsed. The parallels are hard to miss. One of the key factors back then was a sharp fall in oil prices. That shock quickly undermined the economic foundations of the Soviet state. Today, Russia is facing the same kind of sustained decline in oil prices. No one knows how low they will go or how long this will last, and this is not just a personal view. The Central Bank of Russia has acknowledged it. The government has as well. Both note clear similarities with the period that ended in the collapse of the USSR and the brutal 1990s that followed. Over the course of the war, Russia itself has changed dramatically. It is increasingly turning inward, especially in its relations with Europe. In the past, the model was simple. Europe bought Russian raw materials. Russia bought European technologies and consumer goods. That system worked for decades. Now, because of the war and sanctions, Russia has almost completely shut its window to the West. Only a few narrow openings remain. A port near St. Petersburg, limited service channels. As a result, Russia has largely turned toward China, and in this setup, vast areas west of the Volga lose strategic value. No major transit routes pass through them. They no longer matter for trade or logistics. This creates uncomfortable questions inside Russia itself. If oil is shipped to China, why is Moscow needed at all? Why does it take the money while playing no role in the process? Why did Moscow start a war while regions like Tyumen face fuel shortages? These are the same doubts about extreme centralization that once emerged in the Soviet Union, and those doubts eventually led to its rapid collapse. Today, the same warning signs are appearing in Russia again.
Some of the main beneficiaries of Russia's oil and gas crisis have been China and India. From January to September 2025, more than 80% of Russia's crude oil exports went to these 2 countries. However, under the threat of secondary sanctions, imports from Russia to China have almost been cut in half. India's Reliance Industries has increased oil purchases from the United States and the Middle East, particularly from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Qatar. Turkey is also reducing imports of Russian crude. Ankara has expanded cooperation with the Kremlin's oil competitors, Iraq and Kazakhstan. If we look at what is happening now with Russia's oil and gas sales, taking into account the countries that are already refusing these purchases, how would you assess the situation?
Russia is a country that lives off oil exports. Gas exports matter less, even though they always looked impressive politically. But in financial terms, gas has always brought in far less money than oil. So Russia really is a drilling rig disguised as a country. The problem is that by creating this sanctions environment and using war as a tool against Ukraine, Russia has made itself toxic. At the same time, global oil production has increased and new players have emerged. Countries like Guyana, for example, a Latin American state near Venezuela, where oil production is now expanding rapidly. This means there are more producers willing to sell oil on the global market. Many of them are not part of OPEC, and they are not friendly toward Russia because Russia is a competitor. And why would anyone want a competitor? All of this together has led to falling oil prices. And when prices fall and global demand for Russian oil declines, Russia's revenues shrink. That brings us to the situation you mentioned earlier. Russia can no longer earn enough to sustain itself, because what else does it sell? Heavy machinery? No. Software products, services, the internet economy? No. Russia does not sell or provide any of this. Even those who once developed software or game products inside Russia have left.
Today, we are witnessing a rapid weakening of Russian influence, both in the Middle East and in the South Caucasus. Until recently, Russia positioned itself as the main arbiter in Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. Now the sides conduct dialogue without Kremlin mediation. Central Asian countries are increasingly orienting themselves toward China as the main security guarantor in the region. In addition, the European Union is expanding contacts with Central Asian states, discussing the development of the so-called Middle Corridor, a trans-Caspian transport route. This corridor is seen as an alternative link connecting China and the EU through Central Asia, the South Caucasus, Ukraine, and several other countries.
Vladimir, what role does the loss of Russia's influence, at least in the post-Soviet space, particularly in Central Asia, play in pressuring Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin elites? They understand that they are losing more than they gain by waging war against Ukraine, do they not?
I think this understanding exists. They simply do not want to admit it publicly, because admitting it would mean admitting their own weakness. But it is obvious to everyone, including inside Russia itself. Take Azerbaijan. The loss may not be complete in a formal sense, but strategically, Russia has already lost it. Azerbaijan was never truly part of the post-Soviet structures built by Moscow. I mean, the CSTO, the Eurasian Union. It does not want to be a Kremlin vassal. It wants to pursue an independent policy. In the South Caucasus, across the post-Soviet space, and in the Middle East. An even clearer example is Central Asia, the former Soviet Central Asian region. It is obvious that most countries there, especially the larger ones like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, are now actively pursuing a multi-vector policy. They are carefully balancing their interests within a triangle: Beijing, Washington, and Moscow. Take Kazakhstan. It is formally a member of the Eurasian Union. It has even announced a new strategic partnership, but at the same time, it keeps its distance from Moscow. Kazakhstan plays on the contradictions between Russia and the West, and on the fact that China is steadily increasing its influence in Central Asia. This allows them to neutralize risks. I know this not just from analysis, but from personal conversations with Kazakh diplomats, with experts, with journalists. Despite all the partnership rhetoric directed at Moscow, they clearly understand one thing. The Kremlin looks at northern Kazakhstan the same way it once looked at Crimea, at Donbass, at Russian-speaking regions in neighboring countries. For them, the threat is the same as it was for us, regardless of the existence of the Eurasian Union. And from this perspective, distancing themselves from Moscow becomes a rational strategy, not a sudden break, but a gradual withdrawal, a slow, careful exit from under Russian influence.
By launching a full-scale war, Russia signed its own verdict as a state capable of engaging on equal terms with democratic countries. Its failure to seize Ukraine militarily has also destroyed Russia's image as a military superpower. Looking ahead to 2026, what is your realistic forecast for Russia? Do you expect a default? And how will the economic situation affect ordinary Russians?
When I said back in 2022 that Russia would be cut out of the global economy, many critics told me I was talking nonsense. They said it was impossible, that the world economy could not survive without Russia. They predicted catastrophe. Europe would collapse, the world would shake. Gasoline prices would become unbearable. American presidents would resign one after another because of fuel prices. 4 years of war have passed. None of that happened. On the contrary, the process of cutting Russia out of the global economy is now clearly visible. It is increasingly hard to deny. Even Russian mass media are starting to discuss it. Europe suffered after refusing Russian gas and oil, yes, but it did not die. It continues to live, and it continues to finance Ukraine's fight against Russia. Europe found alternatives. The rest of the world was happy to buy cheap Russian oil, and even that oil can be replaced.
Vladimir, how would you assess the readiness of the United States and of Donald Trump personally to act more harshly toward the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, especially considering the recent remark by Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who said that America has now become more of a stick than a carrot for Moscow?
That is exactly where the problem lies. The whole idea of the stick and the carrot. It is a traditional method. These images emerged back in the 19th century and have been used ever since. Trump likes this kind of metaphor. His advisors do as well, including Keith Kellogg and several others. Even before Trump became president, this approach was proposed to him, both in relation to Russia and to Ukraine. Let me give just one example of how this was supposed to work. Weapons for Ukraine. At that time, financial support was barely discussed. If anything, the conversation went in the opposite direction. But weapons were central. The logic was simple. If Ukraine refused to negotiate peace, American arms supplies could be limited or even halted. If Russia refused to end the war, then arms deliveries to Ukraine should be increased. And here is the core problem with Trump and his administration. This recommendation was applied, but only partially, and mainly toward Ukraine. Thankfully, not fully, mostly through hints and signals. But toward Russia, this method has not really worked so far. There are only vague warnings, general statements, no consistent pressure. There is, however, one positive shift where I agree with Finnish President Alexander Stubb. Trump has finally begun to think seriously about using the stick against Russia. But how does this look in practice? It is less about actually using the stick and more about showing it, about saying, look, I can take this stick out and use it against you. There is only one area where the stick has been applied in a concrete way, and it is already producing visible results. These are sanctions against Russia's largest oil companies, the core of its energy sector. I believe this can work in the long term, but only under certain conditions, not just sanctions alone, but secondary sanctions as well, against those who continue to buy Russian oil. And crucially, this pressure package must also include weapons for Ukraine, including long-range weapons. Pressure must be comprehensive, from the political stance in negotiations to military assistance to stronger sanctions. The stick should not just be shown, it has to be used.
Russia continues its attempts to fracture Western unity by expanding hybrid operations against Europe escalating terror against Ukraine's civilian population and destroying critical infrastructure on the eve of winter. The Kremlin is trying to convince the West that further resistance is pointless. But trying does not mean succeeding. The EU is already working on a 20th package of sanctions against Russia. The new measures are expected to target Russia's financial and energy sectors. Sanctions are also placing growing pressure on the military machine of the Russian Federation.
The paradox of the current situation is that Putin believed a war of attrition, a prolonged war, would clearly favor Russia and doom Ukraine. But we are holding on. It is hard, extremely hard. Yes, Russia is striking our energy system. Yes, Russia has greater resources, but we are holding. This is a crucial point. The Kremlin is betting not so much on its own military victories, but on the idea that Ukraine will break and collapse. Russian sources say this openly. That strategy is not working. Instead, problems are emerging inside Russia. The internal financial situation is deteriorating. Trends are already obvious. There are problems in the oil market. Prices are declining. Even if they fluctuate, the downward trend is clear, and that weakens Russia's ability to finance the war. The situation is developing in a non-standard, non-linear way. The year 2026 may become decisive in terms of how the war unfolds. It is possible, and I do not rule this out, that real negotiations on ending the war, or at least a ceasefire, could begin in 2026. This may sound optimistic today, but if the military situation stabilizes, if Putin eventually realizes that he cannot win this war, that Ukraine is not collapsing, and that Russia's internal problems are mounting, combined with continued pressure from Trump, if that pressure persists and intensifies, then a scenario becomes possible in which negotiations gradually begin, perhaps starting with a phased ceasefire. The key thing is to maintain pressure on Russia.
Putin's obsessive desire to restore Russia's global influence, subjugate Ukraine, and entrench himself in Eastern Europe has already turned into a catastrophe for the Kremlin itself. By unleashing the war, the Russian dictator expected a quick victory. Instead, he provoked a firm and unified response from Europe. Western countries began strengthening their defense capabilities and expanding support for Ukraine. Germany is increasing its military capacity for the first time in decades. Security cooperation is deepening across Europe. Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. The EU's entire defense industrial strategy is aimed at unifying weapons systems and reducing dependence on supplies from outside the Union. The Rearm Europe initiative, announced in Brussels in March, envisages investments of €800 billion to strengthen regional defense and support Ukraine. In the face of Putin's threat, Europe cannot afford weakness. It is demonstrating unity and making it clear to Russia that it has no right to dictate the future to anyone.